Acts 24, as the book goes, it really moves pretty quickly from, well, really where we started last week through the end of the book. And it's all very much related now because from the trouble that Paul had in Jerusalem with the Jews that have, well, now tried to set up a trap to kill him, the rest of the book is Paul going all the way to Rome because of these legal accusations. And there's a few different hearings that he goes through. There's a period of sailing and shipwreck, and that ends us in Rome, where Paul sort of lives out the last of his days. But we're not quite there yet. But just to say that it's going to move pretty quickly, so we'll probably be done with the book of Acts. I would say by Easter, which is only a month away. So as we're thinking toward those things, just to back us up for a few minutes, just to get us into chapter 24. If you remember, there was Paul was waiting for a hearing. There was a plan to kill him. They were going to set up an ambush on his travels, and his nephew actually heard that and went to the authorities and kind of gave him that tip. And because Paul was a Roman citizen, they listened, and they actually took measures to preserve Paul's life so that he would not be wrongfully executed by those accusing him. So that's what really transpires in the end of chapter number 23. And that brings us to Felix. Paul comes before Felix, who is kind of probably one of the highest on the chains as far as Rome's relationship with Judea. So they're going up the ladder. They go to Caesarea, which is nearby Jerusalem, but that's where the seat of this Felix is, who is a ruler, an under ruler, not in the reign of the Caesar, but as far as the relationship of Rome with the Jewish people. And they take the case to him. So that's where we're going to pick up the story, and we'll just read down through verse number 21 to get started. So let's split it up a little bit. Somebody want to read 1 through 8? Chapter 24, 1 through 8. Okay, Matt. And then if somebody wants to read, Dennis, maybe you want to read 9 through 13, and then I'll read the end of the chapter 14 and following. Okay.
And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and spoke one Tertullius. They laid before the governor their case against Paul, and when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made to this nation, in every way and everywhere we accept us with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world, and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him."
The other Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. When the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, "I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple, or stirring up a crowd in synagogues or anywhere else in the city. And they cannot prove to you the charges they are now making against me."
Okay. This I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there would be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. And now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. And while I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple, without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you to make an accusation, if they have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before that council, other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them. It is with the respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. Okay, so we have Paul. They took Paul to Caesarea to meet before Felix, and they basically summoned the witnesses from Jerusalem who were making this accusation. And so we start off in the beginning of the chapter. The high priest came with elders and some spokesmen, and specifically one named Tertullus. And he was basically the mouthpiece of this whole group that was making accusations against Paul. He starts off by, a little political language. Through you, Felix, we enjoy much peace. And by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made in this nation. In every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. This is kind of a little side note that keeps in mind how fragile this relationship between Rome and Judea was, and people were aware with that. That's even in the days of Jesus. That's a big part of the tension with the Pharisees and the leaders in that day. Was, let's not cause something that's gonna make us look bad in Rome's eyes. So you have to keep that in mind with Paul as well. So if it seems like this guy is kind of sweet talking Felix, he is a little bit. But then he gets right to the point, and he lists the accusations against Paul. So what do we find then? Really in verse number 4, 5, 6. What are the accusations that are brought against Paul? Okay, he's stirring up riots, so he's a general troublemaker, seems. What else? Okay, he's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect. Now, there's a couple. Yeah, well, there's a couple instances in this passage specifically where we see a little bit of how these groups, whether it's the Jews here or the Roman authorities, how they are viewing now these followers of Jesus. And that's a description. The Nazarene sect, they had started to call the followers of Jesus the follower of the Nazarene, because they linked Jesus back to his lineage in Nazareth from Joseph. Even in his day, that was a derogatory way of looking at it, as they asked questions like, can anything good come out of Nazareth? So the Nazarene, that's their way of identifying Jesus without saying his name. And there's another way, another term that gets used here a couple times by Paul to refer to these followers of Jesus, and that is the term the way. If you have that in your Bible, it might be capitalized because it's a reference to that. Really, it's a reference back to the words of Jesus when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So that's a little snippet. That's they're viewing these Jesus followers as a cult, as a sect, and Paul is a ringleader. What else did they accuse him of?
Was purging the temple.
Yeah, he even tried to profane the temple. So these are the formal charges brought against Paul. And in their eyes, this is the case they had to make. You know, they thought Paul deserved the death penalty for these things. So what do you think? This is what comes out formally, but is there anything else going on behind the scenes? Is there anything else that they might be thinking of? Are these charges, you know, something they're hoping can stick because they really have bigger problems with Paul, or do you think this is it? Okay.
They really do believe the 3 days is that.
Yeah, I think so.
They really do believe that, they're not getting it. There's also, definitely, you know, they're trying to butterfeel us up.
Right.
They want peace. They're trying to prove favor. They're trying to be left alone. So they get involved.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they didn't really have any specifics for any of that.
Right. Yeah, that's true. A good thing to make a point, Dennis. Yeah, I think Matt's right. I think you're right. They believed these things, but they also couldn't give a whole lot of specifics as far as how these things actually were taking place. I think they had a sense that, you know, they're hearing a lot of movement around the known world with this. Well, these who are following this sect that they call it, these followers of Jesus, and it's probably very troubling to them because they had hoped that would be stamped out when this Jesus guy was crucified. You know, at this point, that's been, you know, probably close to 30 years, maybe 25 years before this, but it's not been stamped out yet. And they're still trying to stamp it out, and mix that with, you know, probably some jealousy, and also the big thing in their mind, as we've talked about, they were just hoping for political peace. So there's a lot going on here, and Paul's found himself right at the center of it. So what does he say then? They give him a chance to speak. It's a fair trial here. That's one of the benefits of his Roman citizenship, is he gets a fair shake. So when Paul gets us his chance to speak his piece, what is his defense? Kind of starts in verse 11, 12, and 13.
Or it didn't happen the way that they made it happen, or did it sound like it happened?
Yeah, he says it's they seem to be blowing things out of proportion. They didn't find me disputing with anybody. He says I went up to worship in Jerusalem. You know, later on he had said he had gone in order to, you know, to bring offerings and tribute, which he did, and they didn't find him. He said they didn't find me causing any trouble. I didn't try to drum up a crowd in the temple or the synagogue or the city, and they can't prove to you what they now bring against me. Now, Paul could have, you know, he could have probably shut his mouth right there, but he didn't, and he kept going, and he confessed something, and he admits in a certain way that, yeah, there was trouble because of me, but it's not because of what they're saying. So what does he confess?
He repeats that what he was preaching was in respect to resurrection.
Yeah, so he did say that, and admit that there is tension here. You know, he says, I think the only thing that caused trouble is when I stood up and said it's with the respect of resurrection from the dead that I'm on trial. And going back to verse 14, he identifies, of course, the differences that he worships according to the way. He worships according to the way, which they call a sect. Now he doubles down and says, I believe everything that they believe from the law and the prophets, and I have the hope in God, which they say they have, that there will be a resurrection. And I try to have a clear conscience before God and man. But he admits, I think the problem is I've made a big deal about what I believe. Now we know, of course, specifically that the problem in their eyes was proclaiming Jesus and the opening of the kingdom of God to the Gentiles. So Paul admits, hey, I haven't done anything wrong. There is trouble, but it's not what it looks like. And so he kind of finds himself, I don't know, he's in an interesting position, right? Because he's having to defend himself really in front of the Roman authorities and keep his ministry going to both Jews and Gentiles at the same time. And right. Yeah, if he can just say the right thing or the wrong thing, then they'll get him. But I think he uses wisdom here in the way that he talks, but he also he doesn't keep his mouth shut, really. Without incriminating himself, he kind of gives the whole story. Any thoughts on what he said? As I was reading through it yesterday and this morning, I think it's pretty amazing the way that Paul used this opportunity, because he clearly kept that connection that, hey, listen, I'm just following what the Lord, what God, who gave us the law and the word, had promised from the beginning. I'm not changing anything up here. I'm just keeping a clear conscience before him. I'm listening to him when he speaks, and I have a clear conscience before men because of that. And he doesn't try to disguise his connection to the Jewish people, but he also doesn't pretend that it's not a big deal. He admits that there's a difference. Any other thoughts you guys had on how Paul handles this? He's not on trial before us, but we can learn from it, I think.
The master class really being both respectful in the midst of an unjust trial, and it's just being honest, not backing down, but the balancing act is amazing. He's not belligerent or arrogant or but he state the facts, respectful, without overdoing it, there's an interesting contrast between his opening and the opening of Tullius.
Yeah.
They're like really buttering him up. Paul's like, I know you're a fair guy. I know you're a trial judge, so I know you're a fair shake.
Yeah. The boldness with respect and wisdom, I think, is what it is. He kind of exemplifies here, and I think that's been important in every generation of the church. But I think it is especially important for us in this day as well. Boldness, the right kind of boldness, with respect and wisdom. It reminds me of Jesus telling his disciples to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. We can't lay down and die, but we also can't. He doesn't want us just to be foolish either with our witness and our opportunities.
I almost wonder if in his mind he was already kind of doing this stuff. Like, I think he had a really good way about him. But I kind of wonder if the back of his mind he knew there was going to be problems like this, and he always faced problems like in his mind already, because this is just done over and over again, the same stuff. This is like, well, they're going to accuse me of this, and so I know this is right because.
Yeah.
You just state it off.
Yeah. Yeah, you had a ready answer. You know, there's a balance there too, you know, because we are told that of course the Lord is with us and his Spirit is with us. And there are times when we will be met with something where we might not be prepared for it, and the Lord will help us. But then there's the contrast of that. For instance, when Peter tells the church to be ready at any time to give, you know, a defense, an answer of the hope that you have. And I think we see that in Paul. He had that readiness. The Lord certainly strengthened him when it came time, but he didn't have to make up a story here. He already knew what he believed and why it was important.
Yeah. Agree to all that. I think it's really helpful to, you look at the way we talk about politics, both leading up to the election and afterward. You know, I don't really want to get into politics, but the reason I don't really want to get into politics is because our discussion about it in the world right now is so abrasive. And so there's a lot of things that I believe in that are important that, you know, I don't want to back down on. And yet there's a lot of folks, and I think I'm guilty of this too, who rallied around, say, certain political ideals, and we get really obnoxious about it. Really rude. And we can convince ourselves, well, I can say this online, I can talk in this way, and you need to deal with it because I'm right. You know, the truth backs me up, you know. I'm very much against abortion. You know, it's a big deal to me. Well, there's a lot of folks out there who rally around this cause, and they're very rude, very obnoxious.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think we're terribly good. We're horrible losers, and we're not very good winners. You know.
Yeah.
And when I hear Paul's speech, his focus was not in being vindicated as much as it was the kingdom.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a good takeaway.
The thing that he comes to is pointing to eternal life and salvation in Christ.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. In Paul's mind, the goal is not, you know, free and vindicated Paul. It's a fair shake for the message. Yeah. Well, let's read on a little bit because it keeps going. We'll just read through the end of the chapter. Somebody want to read those verses 22 through the end of the chapter?
Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. And Lysias, the commander, comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard for to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of the need. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent Paul a listening to him, and he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, that's enough for now, you may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send to you. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison.
Okay. All right, so interesting little snippet here in Paul's story. But we'll start off with this Felix guy. So again, Felix was what at that time was called the procurator, which is basically a legal liaison from Rome to a region. And he was, again, the highest basically representative over Rome, or over the Judeans themselves. Not a king, not really a ruler, but essentially like a Supreme Court judge. different, of course, in a lot of ways, but in comparison, he had a lot of sway, he had a lot of authority. But what do we learn about him? There's maybe a couple things we can pick out of here. Okay, he's well acquainted with the way. He had an accurate knowledge of the way. So what is the way? We talked a little bit about that. Yeah. It's basically it was a title that had come about for the followers of Jesus. You remember we learned in the book of Acts that Christian was another one of those titles. They got that at Antioch, but that wasn't ubiquitous at this point. They called them a number of things: the followers of the Nazarenes, the Christians, the Way. And so we learned that Felix had a pretty good understanding of the Way, or at least he was familiar with them. We'll put a pin in that for a minute and come back to it. But what else do we see about Felix in this story? Okay, he was married to a Jewish woman. Now that could have been, given his position, we aren't really told, could have been, a highly political move to get himself in with one of the locals, so to speak. And what else do we find about him as a person and his interaction with Paul? It says something about what he was hoping for. Yeah, he wanted a bribe. And this kind of jives with the other records that are existent about Felix, is that he was, overall, people liked him as a ruler, as a representative, but he was always willing to work a deal for a few silver coins, as it were. And in this case, we find him kind of split between two, because at the end of his position, when he was succeeded by Porcius Festus, we find that he wanted to do the Jews a favor, and that kind of insinuates there were probably a few favors in both directions over his time there. And couple that with the fact that he kept bringing Paul back to listen to him, to talk about him, hoping that he would be given money. And I think that tells us something about Paul, because, Paul had friends. He had, in fact, Felix gave him freedom. He was kept in custody, but it tells us in verse 23 that his friends could come and go, attend to his needs. By this point, the church is, pretty big. They could have gone around and drummed up probably a halfway decent offering in order to provide a bribe for Felix, and all evidence shows that would have got him let out. But Paul didn't do that. So I think that teaches us something, maybe not just about Paul, but about his friends and the followers of the Lord in that day. They weren't. Paul saw purpose in this. He didn't just want to get out through a side door, and he was willing to continue in faithfulness to the Lord. But what else? What kind of interesting opportunity does this give Paul? Kind of skip over a question, but it seems that Paul's testimony was, at least in this case, was ineffective before the Jews, but this kept giving him opportunities. What kind of opportunity does this give him in this little story with Felix, his wife? Yeah, it seems, every time they came around, Paul kept talking about his faith in Christ. Before both Felix, a Gentile Roman, and his Jewish wife. Now, it seems when they really got down to brass tacks, Felix, would always kind of shut the conversation down. When he got to the topics of righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix got a little uncomfortable. But Paul, used it as a very, very, very faithful opportunity.
It is worth noting, we're probably 10 to 15 years away from things getting so bad in Jerusalem between Rome and the Judeans.
Yeah.
That they're going to get sacked Rome. So there's a lot of weight behind that, trying to do favors for the Jews. You know, the Jews are trying to keep peace.
Absolutely.
And Paul must have felt like he's in, it's going to be a war zone soon.
Yeah.
You know, civil war is brewing, you know. Roman officials are getting assassinated by hardline Jewish
Right.
assassins. You know, I'm trying to think of a part of the world where, you know, it could be similar. You know, and we don't deal with bribes much here in the U.S. It's still a big part of what we go for.
Yeah.
What Christians are living.
Absolutely.
I know some who are okay paying the bribe to continue their ministry, and some who aren't.
Hmm.
And it's nothing I've ever had arrested.
Neither have I. Yep.
Then the missionaries are like, yeah, hold on, he's got to take care of something, you pay the bribe, like, who's that? Then some like, oh, we don't pay bribes, we get detained for 8 hours, whatever.
Right.
But then
It is interesting, the politics part of it is interesting, because he's used politics to his advantage.
Yeah.
Like, I'm a Roman citizen.
Sure.
And then even in his speech before he even in verse 18, they talk about, I was purified in the temple and there was no crowd or tumult when they came and got me. So like all the things that they said I did, I didn't do. And he was honest about that, but when I study Bible also says, he mentioned those things specifically, so Roman governor, that would have been important that there was no riot. Because that's actually what they cared about. They didn't care about the religious part of it. They only
Right.
cared about that part. But then on the other side of it, when it comes to the bribe, like that's where it stops, right? That's going too far. That's just politics. That's not part of the whole ministry aspect, at least the way he viewed it. So.
Yeah. I think it was a bridge too far for him. And also, it would have kind of taken him out of, right now we're going to see in the next weeks, Paul's going to appeal all the way to Caesar, which he had a right to do as a Roman, which means he's got to go to Rome. And if he had paid a bribe to Felix and gotten out, he wouldn't have had an easy journey to Rome. I mean, it wasn't just something you got up and decided, hey, I'm going to go to Rome today. We'll see. It was would have been a month-long journey. It also gets pretty hard based on storms and shipwrecks, but it was in the Lord's providence that through faithfulness, he was going where he was supposed to go. During this one, that's off the top of my head. That's a good question. I don't. Yeah. Right. He ends up in Rome, as far as we know, for the rest of his life. We'll see that at the end of the chip. At the end of the chip. I don't know what that meant. At the end of the book, he's under house arrest, and then that's the last word that the Bible has. And he wrote, he would have written the epistle to the Romans at that point, possibly 2 Corinthians, but yeah. So it's going to be a major time in his life for a lot of reasons. So, all right. Well, thank you guys for study this morning. Let's take a break and we'll come back in 10 or 15 minutes.